Welcome to the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. Are you ever a bit forgetful? Sometimes when I'm reminded that I've forgotten, I panic a bit and I try and make it look like I didn't really forget or do something that makes it worse. Now that's not a quality you really want in a leader of God's people. We need someone better than me, and in 1 Samuel 14 we find we need someone better than King Saul. And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. As we start this, we remember it's in the context of 1 Samuel 13, which happens just beforehand, where Saul was punished for offering a sacrifice. And I think at the time, and even now as you remember it, it seemed a bit harsh on Saul. I mean, he faced a vast enemy with superior weapons. His army was deserting. And Samuel, who was supposed to make the sacrifice, he was late. And Saul's the king. Isn't taking initiative the right kind of thing to do? And yet when Samuel did arrive, he told King Saul, "You have acted foolishly." And the consequence for Saul is that he will not have a dynasty. His kingdom will go to a man described as a man after God's own heart, one that God has laid his heart upon, rather than Saul, the asked-for king. But God's judgment does feel severe. And we, I think, have an instinct to defend Saul, and that reveals something about ourselves, and it's not very comfortable. Last week, in the first half of chapter 14, we started to see a contrast. Jonathan, the son of Saul, he's a man who trusted God. He trusted God, saying, "Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving." And I think we quite like to think that we're like Jonathan. But our ongoing sympathy for Saul shows that we are much more like Saul in the way that we struggle with daily godly obedience. It's a problem that takes us all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. Our forefather Adam's nature is in us also. Like the proverb, like father, like son, or the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or I learned this is the Irish proverb for that idea, she didn't lick it off a stone. It didn't come randomly. It's something that we've picked up from others around us. But our tendency to doubting that God's way is the best way even has a proverb of its own. He's so heavenly minded, he's of no earthly use. And so, because we think that really the instructions in the Bible aren't so practical for everyday real life, we take the things from the Bible that we think are practical and set those things that we don't think fit life in the real world aside. But the Bible sees things differently. Psalm 14 verse 1, "The fool says in his heart there is no God." Not there describing intellectual atheists, but all people who live as if God's word matters less than our own thoughts and our own feelings. Well, last week it ended with Jonathan's faith leading to a great victory. But what about Saul? I mean, he's still the king. What was happening back in the camp while Jonathan was approaching the Philistine army? Of course, what Jonathan was doing was actually his second initiative. His first effort, his first initiative, he'd attacked some Philistine outposts. And actually that was the reason for the terrifying, powerful collection of the Philistine army. And Saul's army, seeing that powerful Philistine enemy start deserting, they're running away for the border. Saul had no idea that his son was up doing his own thing. And so he tries to address the problem of desertion from his camp by his army with this proclamation that we start off with. "Cursed is the man," says Saul, "who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged on my enemies." So none of the people had tasted food. Now, the best way to assess Saul's reaction is to compare it to what his son Jonathan had said last week. Jonathan's response to a crisis of a great enemy is, "Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving." Compare that to Saul. Saul says, "Cursed be the man who eats until I'm avenged on my enemies." Saul, the king the people had asked for so that they can be like the nations, who has disobeyed God's command in chapter 13, doesn't even mention God in this crisis. Instead of trusting God, he fixates on personal vengeance. He fixates on compliance from his army. And this vow that he makes, this oath that he takes, transforms the events of the battle, transforms the extent of the victory that we've already seen recorded in the first half of the chapter that was initiated by Jonathan. Now, in verses 25 and 26, hearing the confusion in the Philistine camp caused by God's use of Jonathan and his friend, the hungry troops proceed. Verse 25, the entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan and his mate weren't in the camp when Paul spoke that oath. Verse 27, but Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with an oath, so he reached the end of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised it to his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Friends, I remember years ago I hiked with a group of friends for a week, and we ended our hike with a river journey that we went down the river on our inflatable beds and strapped our packs to these rubberized canvas inflatable beds, and we floated down the river. Now, we had canned food with us, but we found the potatoes in the cans horribly salty. But the rapids were thrilling on that last day, and as we were going down them, we had a great amount of fun, but we missed the exit. And so we had to go down and down further, and we had to add an extra night to our journey. But we'd already eaten all the food the previous day, except for one can of those salty potatoes. But that night, our hunger and our exhaustion made that lone can of potatoes the best thing we had ever eaten in our lives. And just imagine what finding honey would have been like on that day by Jonathan and all of the others. How bright our eyes would have been. But as Jonathan eats, the soldiers are horrified. Verse 28, one of the soldiers said to him, your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, cursed be anyone who eats the food today. That's why the men are faint. Now, it might be that the God-caused panic made the fight easier, but that didn't make it completely easy. I mean, they are exhausted. And Jonathan sees the harm that has been caused by his father's rash oath. He says, my father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright because I tasted a little of this honey. Oh, how close Jonathan comes to describing his father like Samuel had. You have acted foolishly. The word trouble in that verse has appeared a number of times before in Israel's history. That was significant. It was used when Achan brought to Israel trouble because of his sin in Joshua 7. It's the same word that a man named Jephthah in the book of Judges, chapter 11, brought when he made a rash vow that led to the death of his daughter. And Saul, who disobeyed God's instruction and has not called on God to help with the battle, and instead conceived of a plan to avenge himself, finds it all backfiring. And his son says it straight. Verse 30, how much better it would have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater? In verses 31 and 32 show that it does remain a victory, but the Philistines are beaten back. They're pushed back. but the starved men are exhausted. In verses 32 to 35, their exhaustion leads them to do something significant. The people pounced on the spoil and took the sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. Now, if we were observant Jews reading this, even today, we would see what the hunger brought on by Saul's foolish oath has caused. It has caused Israel to disobey a long-standing command from God, stretching back even to the time of Noah in Genesis chapter 9. It's confirmed in the law of Moses in Leviticus chapter 7. God's people were not to eat meat with the blood left in it. The blood was to be drained. And that's because God had chosen blood to be special. God's chosen blood to symbolize life. And God reserved blood to be used exclusively for atoning sacrifices. It wasn't to be eaten. It was to be drained and used for atoning sacrifices. Leviticus 17:11. But the people's disobedience is caused by Saul's reckless oath. Their obedience to Saul has led to their disobedience to God. Well, what's going to happen in that situation? Well, verse 33, they told Saul, "Behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood." And he said, "You have dealt treacherously. Roll a great stone to me here." And Saul said, "Disperse among yourselves among the people, and say to them, Let every man bring his ox or sheep and slaughter them here and eat. And do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood." So every one of the people brought his ox with him that night and slaughtered them there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first altar that he built to the Lord. Saul, who disobeyed God's command in chapter 13, Saul, who has shown no trust in God in the face of a terrible enemy, who has absurdly decided to starve his own troops, now acts as if he cares about this disobedience. He does it by trying to fix the problem himself, by playing priest, building an altar so that animals could be properly slaughtered. But notice in Saul there is not one little bit of a hint that he takes any responsibility for causing the problem in the first place, by his oath. Well, we come now to verses 36 to 39, and we find Saul sort of alone. Saul thinks he's fixed things, and he suggests finishing things up. He makes a proposal in verse 36. Saul said, "Let's go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them until the morning light. Let's not leave a man of them." Notice here that God's name is still absent from Saul's lips regarding the battle. Compare that to Jonathan, who had said, "It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord for saving by many or by few." But Saul, no reference to God, no trust in him is shown here. And the response of the people is less than enthusiastic, isn't it? They said, "Do whatever seems good to you." Saul's leadership is well described here by the people. You see, Saul's leadership is not characterized or shaped by God's will, by God's word, and by God's command. Saul is doing whatever seems right to him. A very stark contrast to his son Jonathan's careful dependence on God. Someone else has to bring God into Saul's mind. We see the priest says, "Let's draw near to God here." Good idea, but why didn't Saul think of that? Well, Saul inquires of God, "Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel?" Verse 37. Finally, Saul has turned to the God he disobeyed in chapter 13, and he's barely considered in this chapter, and only because this priest, the priest himself with the fairly dodgy credentials, but this priest has prompted Saul. God had given a way to make significant decisions by providing some objects that were held in the priest's breastplate. They're called the Urim and the Thummim. Now, we're not really told how they're supposed to work. That's not really recorded for us. But this day, for King Saul, they didn't work at all. Verse 37, but he, that is God, did not answer Saul that day. Samuel's warning to Saul back in chapter 8 has come true. And now we find that the tendency for leaders to find fault everywhere but in themselves, we find that's not a new phenomenon. Verse 38, Saul said, come here, all you leaders of the people, and know and see how this sin has risen today. For as the Lord lives, who saves Israel, though it be in my son Jonathan, he shall surely die. It's not only God, it seems, who answers Saul with silence in the face of his proposals. There was not a man among all the people who answered Saul. And we find King Saul is abandoned. Silence from God, silence from his people. And the irony is that the oath he had made was to try and stop his people from deserting him. But we find it's actually the oath that has lost him his army. Oh, they're there physically, but he has lost their loyalty. In verses 40 to 46, we have Saul versus Jonathan. And the first question is, where is the blame to be attributed? Well, Saul, not being answered directly by God, decides that he's going to try and cast lots to find out who is at fault. And so he says to all Israel, you shall be on one side, and me and my son Jonathan will be on the other. And the people said to Saul, again, do what seems good to you. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel, give me the right answer. And Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. Saul said, cast the lot between me and Jonathan my son. And Jonathan was taken. That process of casting lots is the same process that had identified Achan in Joshua's day as Israel's troublemaker who had brought trouble to the land. And the same process has identified Saul to be Israel's king. And now Saul uses it again to identify Jonathan as the cause of Israel's problem. But it's obvious to everyone who the troublemaker really is. Saul wasted no time, it seems, in questioning Jonathan. Tell me what you've done, he says. Now there's more irony there. Saul uses the same words that Samuel had used to confront him, the same words that had been used by Joshua to confront Achan. Tell me what you've done. Jonathan's answer exposes how ridiculous the situation is. Jonathan told him, I tasted a little of the honey with the tip of the staff that was in my hand. Here I am, I will die. I think there's sarcasm there. That's my great crime. I tasted a little honey. Clearly I deserve to die. But Saul seems incapable of seeing his own foolishness. Saul says, God do so to me, and more also. You shall surely die, Jonathan. On my own life, he says, I will put you to death, my son. Saul's kingdom is unravelling. From ignoring God's word, to distrusting God in battle, to starving his troops, to pretending to care about sin, and now ready to kill his own son for the sake of a foolish oath that he's made. But that doesn't stop him from opening his mouth again. This time he does mention God. But the people see more clearly than the king. In verse 45, the people say to Saul, Shall Jonathan die, who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not be one hair on his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So the people ransomed Jonathan so that he did not die. We might remember what Jonathan had said earlier in this chapter. it may be that the Lord will work for us. And here the people recognise Jonathan's godly faithfulness in this conflict. He has worked with God this day. The contrast between Saul and Jonathan is clear for all to see. The only person who doesn't seem to see it is Saul. For all the chaos under Saul, the Philistines are pursued back home to their own place in verse 46. But Jonathan's assessment back in verse 30 does prove correct. This is not as decisive a victory as it should have been. The threat remains, and we find out that it remains throughout the rest of Saul's kingship. The chapter finishes with a summary of Saul's reign. Now, the next chapter is critical, but the direction of Saul's reign has been set. It is as if, at this point, Saul's reign is already over. But the summary is given quite objectively. Did you notice that in verses 47 and 48? When Saul had taken the kingship over Israel, he fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the Ammonites, against Edom, against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he routed them. And he did valiantly and struck the Amalekites and delivered Israel out of the hands of those who plundered them. Oh, he does more than what we have recorded in 1 Samuel, in detail at least, and it seems that Saul did prove himself on the battlefield at a variety of times, with real gains and real victories for God's people. But that does not make up for his great failure. His great failure to trust and obey the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in verses 49 to 51, we have Saul's family described, and a number of those characters there we will meet in coming chapters. But Saul's legacy is described and summarised in two statements in verse 52. There was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. The problem that Saul was anointed to solve back in chapter 9 goes unresolved throughout his whole kingship. In fact, his reign would ultimately end in a battle against the Philistines in chapter 31. Second, and when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he attached him to himself, echoing Samuel's warning to Israel of what a king like the nations have would do. He will take your sons. Now, one of those valiant men that he takes will soon take centre stage. Saul is among history's greatest tragic figures. It is a tragedy that you and I think, find familiar, because we see our failures in his. I mean, are you not characterised by forgetting God? I mean, I am. Are you not characterised by lack of trust? I am. Are you not plagued by constant disobedience, that you even regret as you're doing it? I am. Samuel warned Saul that such faithlessness was foolish. And Samuel's warning points out my own foolishness. And don't they strike true for you also? Saul's attempts to save himself were as absurd as his rash oath. And I keep on thinking I can sort things out with God myself. We humans keep trying to do deals with God, even today. If I do this, God, you will be obliged to do that for me. If I can do this, then it will make up for what I did over there. And aren't we so good at blaming others for the things that we've done, hoping to deceive others that we are blameless? Oh, it wasn't me, it was him. It was you, it was everyone else, except me. It's been the same since Adam blamed Eve and then blamed God himself while the juice of the fruit was on his own lips. Like Saul, we cannot save anyone else. Like Saul, we cannot even save ourselves. Jonathan knew, only God can save. He alone delivers us from our real enemies, and he will do so. See, friends, Saul's story teaches us a personal lesson. The personal lesson is, do not be like Saul. Do not forget God. Trust him. Obey him. But there's an even greater lesson. For if we cannot save ourselves, because we are forgetful, we fail to trust and we fail to obey, if we cannot save ourselves because of our own foolish forgetfulness, if our own disobedience earns a debt that we cannot repay, a debt of human death, then what we really need is a king better than Saul, a king who will represent us, a king who will fight that battle, who will pay that debt. Oh, Saul was too much like us. He was not the king we need. No, Saul's failure points us toward the king who will succeed where Saul failed. The one who said, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock." Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks.